Welcome to the Economy Wellbeing podcast. Dr. Zach Bush is my guest today, and thrilled to have you, Zach. You've become a superstar, I think, in the last 8 months during the pandemic, and I'm really thrilled to gotten to know you over the last few months and your work in with Farmers Footprint, with blockchain called Humani, and Atlas Blue, and all the other amazing initiatives you're involved in. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your current focus and passion.
Awesome. Yeah, it's been a journey from very allopathic training in medicine. I was trained in the Western medical mindset, a pharmaceutical approach to finding, solutions and cures to disease through pharmacy was definitely, how I was trained. And it was, a long and winding road to find myself into the world of nutrition from there. But basically by 2010, I had, spent a couple of years doing chemotherapy development around the vitamin A compounds. And, ironically, it was not but for a couple of years of being in that space before I realized that meant that food would be good for us. Like somebody hears vitamin A can kill cancer, you would think, oh, we should all go eat a bunch of carrots. But that took me literally years to get to that realization of like, why am I, working with these, extracted molecules in the lab rather than just asking the deeper questions with food. And so that was what got me to start to really transition, and attempted to start a nutrition center at the university, but found a lot of roadblocks from the dietitians who were very steeped in and pretty much required to be, in duty to the food pyramid, and that we couldn't depart from this message that, all food groups are important, and you can't, don't tell anybody not to eat dairy. That's the top of the pyramid,
Hmm.
and so, the way in which we devised that food pyramid was so ironic that, at the base was fruits and vegetables, and at the top is this, meat and dairy and all of this, and the mindset of the human is that hierarchy always is the most important stuff's always at the top, and so
Yeah,
even though it was a
pyramid is like
smaller triangle, the mindset was the hierarchy is, my god, dairy is like the king of protein, and my god, don't stop eating meat, you'll never be able to get any protein from anywhere, so there was this subtle programming that brilliantly got baked into that, because the food pyramid was not created out of a science lab. It was created by special interests in the food industry. And so the meat and dairy industries were very integral in creating that food pyramid for the USDA and
mm,
the general consumer marketplace in the 1970s. So we were kind of, I think it was a very subtle programming that we began to, certainly even before that, believe that the meat and protein industry was the most important avenue into human health, and that the protein was the prized nutrient somehow for staving off uh, s- starvation, as well as fueling the optimal body. And some of
mm.
this came through subtle programming in World War II, even in that there was a huge campaign to save your chickens for the troops was the campaign. And so instead of eating chickens, everybody was encouraged to send chickens to the troops. And so there was this perception that the Captain America image of the U.S. soldier that was out there in the propaganda of World War
Mm.
II was being fueled by chicken. And not surprisingly, as soon as World War II ended, the consumption of chicken per household exploded in the US. We weren't eating many chickens before World War II because mostly we were using them as egg layers. But it exploded for this perception of, wow, we could all be, muscly Captain Americas if we could just get enough chicken into our kids.
Fascinating.
And so there was this programming that began, and it was so much so that we were exporting that belief system to the developing world. And so the Philippines was under massive starvation problems coming out of World War II, in part due to our own, mismanagement of our, kind of hegemony during World War II of the Philippines. But
Hmm.
they were starving, and so the government sent over a contingent that included Colin Campbell from Cornell to study the starvation and put together a protein project to reverse starvation there and hunger in the Philippines. So they put in a very high protein, high dairy methodology there, and came back 10 years later to find that hunger had been eradicated, but there had been an explosion in childhood cancer that had never existed in the country before. And a lot of people thought, well, maybe it's World War II munitions, maybe it's something else. And while all those probably were not good for these kids, Colin Campbell was the first to ask that really amazing question of, I wonder if protein can cause cancer. So that was the 1970s that he really started to roll out some amazing studies that was showing that the protein, specifically in beef, that we were trying to get to these kids was capable of causing liver cancer. And he did some amazing controlled studies showing that you could induce liver cancer with this high protein diet, and that as soon as you took them off the high protein diet, the cancer would shrink. If you put them back on the high protein, it would grow again, and you could take them off and it would shrink. And so it was this ridiculous study showing that you could induce this, tumor growth and contraction based on how much or how little protein you're giving the animal. And so that, led ultimately to the largest nutrition study that had ever been done in the history of mankind, which was done in the developing world, in China. And the China study was finally published by Colin Campbell's team, because the U.S. government, that agencies at the NIH that had funded that, refused to publish the data because it was so inflammatory. I guess quite
Mm,
literally inflammatory. It was showing that the more protein we added to the diets of Chinese, and it was in 160 different provinces throughout China. It was, thousands and thousands. There was of people enrolled, over 100,000 enrolled. There was 1,200 health workers trained up in China to go from household to household to collect data. Just an extraordinary effort, like one of the most robust nutrition efforts in history. And it showed that, every gram of protein that was natural, was in the, cultural diet of those provinces, every gram of animal protein in that increased the risk of cancer death. So it was a fascinating study. It was fascinating, change in not just cancer, but also cardiovascular disease, showing that protein was causing cardiovascular disease was an
wow.
aha moment, because we thought it was cholesterol up until that time. And so, it's just been an interesting journey. And China's study was published in the 1990s finally. And still industry was able to bury that data,
Amazing.
and keep it suppressed. And so that's a long-winded
Wow.
answer to say, by the time I was leaving the cancer research mindset, I was starting to be exposed to all this data that I had never been taught in medical school or residency or subspecialty fellowships. Like, I had gone for 20 years through academia without learning that there had been massive evidence-based studies showing the damage done by protein, and yet we had no idea. So that was my,
Okay.
embarrassing endpoint of
Wow.
academia. I need to start over again. I need to
So,
start from
sounds like
scratch.
me in economics. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's
I
so,
think in some ways that is true, that
but
anybody who gets to the pinnacle of a previous paradigm and needs to move on has to do the journey. You have to walk to the top of your paradigm to even get your head above the clouds.
yeah, and you shake your head. You're almost disappointed that we didn't know more about the amazing nature of our bodies and right our ability to heal with food. Um, I mean, economics is a whole other dismal science. Uh, what years was Campbell doing this study in China?
1980s. So that wrapped up in
1980s.
1992. That study wrapped up, or end of 91, somewhere in there. And they tried to publish a bunch of different, peer-reviewed studies coming out of that, most of which never came to light. So it all ended up getting published in that comprehensive book called The China Study. Um, and that's been, systematically, people have tried to attack that book and everything else, but the data is all sitting right in front of you. It's again the largest study, and they'll say, well, the methodology, this or that. Like, well, you can try to lambast the methodology, but no better study has ever been done in nutrition. And so it is the biggest,
Fascinating.
most comprehensive study ever done. And so that's the resistance of the industry, I think, to
Yeah.
real data. And it led to my need to start over. And instead of starting over saying I'm going to try to go read a bunch of literature, I see that I need to start to apply this stuff to me and my patients. And so I became plant-based in 2009, and have been living that lifestyle ever since, with an emphasis on, at least 95% of the food consumed is from plants. And that's the goal for all of my patients. We try not to be dogmatic about it. We don't really care about the word vegan or something like that. It's really about, can you get 95% of your nutrients from the diversity and fiber content, fiber backed content of of the fruits and vegetables. And so that has been the big push. And
Wow.
it was in applying it that I learned a lot, and not only of its efficacy, but also of its limitations. And so by 2012, we were seeing a third of our patients were getting worse on what we thought was the healthiest food on the planet. We were feeding them massive amounts of kale,
Kale,
cruciferous
broccoli.
vegetables, yeah, and they were inflammation markers going up, not down. And so we discovered in the application of the science and the writings that yes, powerful tool, but there's deeper science and deeper reality beneath the food today that started leading me down this slippery track to studying plants, then studying the soil to find out, oh my God, our agricultural system has changed so much since the 1970s and 80s when Colin Campbell did all that science.
Mm.
We don't have kale that looks like kale of the 1980s anymore. We have kale grown under conventional settings that pale in comparison, are missing all of the anti-inflammatory compounds, missing a lot of the alkaloids, and therefore you end up with a lot of insoluble fiber that when it hits a leaking gut, you'll end up inducing an inflammatory reaction. And unfortunately, the kale is good at carrying the herbicide glyphosate, and so you end up with a cruciferous vegetable in the form of this kale that's carrying a toxin that opens up the gut membrane to create a leaky sieve, and it's carrying now a bunch of insoluble fiber that's relatively inflammatory for the body that was never intended to be inside the body. Insoluble fiber has a huge anti-cancer effect for colon cancer and the like when it stays in the gut, but if it starts leaking into the immune system, difficult situation. And then it's missing the anti-inflammatories that might be able to help ameliorate some of those problems. So it was the debut. Kale in some ways was the thing that changed my viewpoint, that we can't say that things are health food. We have to actually ask much deeper questions of where was it grown, what was the soil conditions it was grown in, and what was the microbiome diversity it was grown in, and what are the nutrients that end up on the plate for the consumer. And that's daunting because we're so far from that in the labeling world
Well,
of USDA and EPA in the United States.
may I just interject, having being a, as a forester, I've delved into why is it, or even looking at agriculture. So we're so focused on yields, right? So, but yields are only possible in part based on the fertilizers and the herbicides and the input you put in. But little attention was ever paid to the natural soil health, however that could be measured in terms of pH or mycorrhizome or uh, whatever whatever those markers are of integrity. And it's amazing that our entire, certainly as government ministries I've worked with, pay no attention to that vital question of how healthy and vibrant is the soil itself.
That's
Uh,
right.
so those are all fundamental questions in this economy well-being discussion. Is if so we've come from we're in an industrial agriculture. I've seen also China getting addicted to that system too, and having been advisor to China, saying you might pause for a minute and go back to your ancient understanding of health. I'm curious about you've obviously heard of Bobby Dr. Weston Price, his work
Sure.
in the 50s or even earlier on the relationship with food and dental health, but also the Blue Zones book, that um, the exploration of longevity in diet. And I think that book points to places like Okinawa, places. Well, is a plant-based diet simply better in terms of overall longevity? And I, I'm sure Dr. Michael Greger, who's also become an educator for me in terms of appreciating plant-based diets. So,
Yeah, I think it's interesting. The blue zones, when broadly looked at, you can't nail down a single diet. They're all
mhm.
over the map. You've got a lot of very high mountain communities in China that are blue zones that are mostly, hunter gatherer kind of things where it's nuts, seeds, legumes, veggies, herbs. And then there's ocean, lots of fish, lots of this, and then there's plains with high protein, antelope and some of these grazing animals as their main diet. You can find them all in the blue
Mhm.
zones. And so what we're learning as the last 30 years is really, well, 20 years, I guess, is really more accurate. The last 20 years has been the revolution of the microbiome, right? And this has come out
Mhm.
of genomics. And so
Right.
we're starting to realize that we were attributing a whole bunch of things to our macro understanding of nutrition, meaning that there was protein or there's carbohydrates or fiber or whatever it is, and we were missing the whole message that was much deeper than that, which is the medicine within the food is more important than the macronutrients. And so the medicine within the food comes from the ability of the soil systems and the animals that would graze in those systems to be in touch with extreme biodiversity. And if you start to narrow the biodiversity of the soil, then the plants suffer. If the plants suffer, then the
Mm.
animals grazing on them suffer. And so in the end, a stressed out food system, no matter what protein carbohydrate ratio is a stressed out food system.
Right, right.
A non-stressed food system, meaning, as much access to its natural state as possible, is going to be something that's capable of passing on, great, great nutritional capacity.
Mm.
But as we're talking about the blue zones, it's interesting. I got caught by a brilliant couple out of uh, Icaria, Greece, which is an island that's one of the blue zones in the
Yeah.
world.
So is
And
Sardinia.
yeah,
Yeah.
and so
I love
this
the
couple,
Sardinian story of the men, raising their goats or sheep and eating a big block of pecorino cheese every day and a good glass, a few glasses of wine,
yeah,
but
yeah,
staying away from their women probably all day so they can come home
yeah,
happy.
stress free there. So yeah, no, I think that and the women weren't stressed because the guys weren't around. It all worked out. So I think that there's something to that, and that with this couple that flew over from Icaria, Greece, they were flown in to prepare a traditional 5-course Greek meal that would be typical of Icaria, and they foraged in the countryside of Virginia for a few days to get the ingredients put together for this meal.
Wow.
And it was an extraordinary experience. Like the first dish was just an onion. She had baked these onions whole and described the love that she put into this onion with the way in which she found it in the countryside. She was completely appalled at the onions in our grocery stores. She's like, they're massive. They're just way overgrown. They're missing all of their beauty. You want young onions that are small and are in their still generative phase rather than degenerative phase. Like you want it to be sweet, not harsh, and all of these things, and then just basted with oil and sea salt on top of it and
So
bake the
simple.
onion whole. And the taste of that onion blew my mind. And all of us, there was 17, 18 of us something eating together. Extraordinary experience. And so we went through and multiple times in tears because it was just so beautiful how much
Mm.
love she had for the food and the soil. And so I stood up at the end to toast her and her husband, thank you for this experience. Like our microbiomes are in such gratitude, and the microbiomes are feeding the mitochondria. And we're just like in this, like, I thought it was the most, beautiful thing. And the gentleman stood up and he said, "You're completely wrong, Doc." And I laughed and I said, well, then I'm eager to learn from you. And so I sat down and he said, uh, you guys are confused that the food that we eat in Icaria is the reason we live long. But the reason we live long in Icaria is because every night we set an extra set and a chair at the table, hoping that somebody shows up for dinner. And we never ask each other in the morning, "What did you eat last night?" We always ask, "Who did you eat with last night?" And the
Gosh.
reason we live long in these places is because we are connected, and we are always eager for community, and we always live in multi-generational communities. We honor our elders. Our elders live among us. Our elders continue to work and play important roles on these farms. It's not unusual for you to find somebody who's over 100 years of old, weeding in the morning, and still working the farm. And he lives on a fifth generation farm, and five generations in Icaria is actually 530 years old. And so his
Yeah,
farm
that's
has
right.
been five generations, but 530-year-old farm. And so it's just an incredible, demonstration that we keep attributing a bunch of stuff to food. And then unfortunately, we even attribute it to a more narrow perspective, which is protein or something like that. And then we make all these conclusions. But in reality, what we're talking about when we start to talk about soil, water, and air, and their interaction with sunshine to create something like an onion, or to create a crop, or a grassland that the antelope or the herd would roam on and graze. We're talking about a biophotonic energetic event, the energy from the sun literally charging the soil, charging the chlorophyll within the plant, that then would create carbohydrates and fat, such that we would have a battery for the biophotonic energy of the sun that would then be transferred ultimately to our mitochondria inside of our cells. And when we break apart the carbon molecules, we liberate energy from that battery, that is, protein or carbohydrate. And both of those are used identically at the mitochondrial level. Mitochondria doesn't matter if it's a fat or carbohydrate; it turns it into the exact same molecule in one enzyme step called acyl CoA. So the mitochondria couldn't care less if it's fat or sugar; it's just going to do the exact same thing. And so, in the end, we've so screwed up our understanding of macronutrients, and so not understanding that we're talking about biophotonic energy when we talk about food. And when you talk about energy, and then you talk about a human species, what is the energy for? The energy, if it's not to connect together, if it's not to create community, if it's not to be in reverence to one another,
Hmm.
then we're going to fail, and, and
Right.
and we will not see longevity if we continue to attribute the value in the food instead of to the person that we're sharing that food with.
That's fantastic. Wow, you've just opened up all kinds of further avenues. So my own experience, I remember my grandmother coming from Germany, and similar story. We went to Jasper the Mountains, and she was out foraging the forests, and she came back with a little bowl of mushrooms. And of course, the natural question is, are those safe to eat? She goes, yes, they are. But you're from Germany. It's like, I know what I'm looking for. I know what to forage for. And they were the most amazing omelets the next morning in the campground.
Wow.
Like just a taste that you never get with, any store bought. So I agree with you that that experience of, and you talked about the basis. They say the science of happiness is 40% is relationship.
Yeah.
Only 10% is related to how much money you make. So I always say, well, why can't we spend more time looking at the economics of relationships? And you define this beautiful story that it is all about relationships, and you can get all fuzzy and woo woo about how much love do you put into your onions and cooking. And we experienced it in Italy outside of Florence with Giuseppina, who is this our villa chef from Sicily, and we went to the store down in the valley, and she said, "No, we're not picking those artichokes. We'll pick those artichokes. They just came off the field." And again, the experience was so sublime. It's like how come we can't eat that way every day?
Yeah.
And it wasn't just Giuseppina. It was just sort of thinking about the relationships, how far the the produce came uh, from the field to your table, and so the question I'm asking is, that's fantastic. I think we're rediscovering the wisdom of that those traditions, and especially indigenous people teach us. They just remind us, whether you're in Hawaii or on Turtle Island, it's all about relationships. In fact, they say that before they go in the sweat lodge. And like, what are they talking about? Or the relationship with the sun, and that magnificent relationship it has with everything. Why is it, do you feel, that humanity, in our sort of arrogance or drive to productivity and GDP growth and all of these other kind of financial aspirations, have caused us such, um, I wouldn't say despair, but here we are in a pandemic, and I think the virus is teaching us something, maybe humbling us in a very mysterious way, a good way. I'm glad we're staying put for a while, because maybe we'll reflect long enough to go, those relationships were the most precious things. Hugging my parents was the best thing because it was like medicine. So how, it's a rhetorical question, is why do we get so caught up in this arrogance of and this desire for productivity and all those economic terms, and how do we return to this wisdom you're talking about? This is just common sense wisdom that is still alive in many cultures.
Yeah, yeah, I think it's maybe the $1,000,000 question, not to be ironic with that, but, yeah, I think that human behavior is a fascinating science, to start to look at what shapes our behavior on the macro level, on the individual level. I think that at our best, our behavior is shaped by a sense of awe of this extraordinary universe that we live within. And the best way to experience that, I think, in a lot of ways, is to sit around a campfire together on a beach or in a countryside or on a mountaintop and look up into the stars. And I think that's how we began as a species. We sat around campfires, and once we had found fire, at least we were sitting around those campfires. Maybe before that, we were just sitting around lightning strikes or something like that. But we sat around fire and we stared up into the sky, into the cosmos, and we wondered at the expanse out there, and we had a really deep sense of how tiny we were at the physical level when we swam in the ocean or hiked to the top of a 14,000-foot mountain. We had this awe-inspired sense of our position within a grand universe of beauty. And we also had a sense of how magnificent we were at the same time, that we had been gifted with life, which and cognition and
Mm,
consciousness. And so we also had a sense, that not only are we small within this vast, ecosystem of beauty of the universe, we're also massive in our capacity to co-create with her. And we can create story, and we can create music, and we can create dance. And these are the things that shaped human culture and society. And one of the interesting quotes out there, I can't even remember who said it now, is humanity is not made of cells, but is of stories. And I think that that's
mm.
really powerful, because as we get into this new era of consciousness, we have to realize it's an old era. Like, we've been realizing the power of stories since our origin. We're just rediscovering, perhaps, that when we tell a potent narrative, we shape the reality around us. So that's at our best. At our worst, we use that narrative to induce negative emotions of fear and guilt. And if we do that,
Mm.
uh, then we will manifest the worst of what we do as humanity. We will be a consumptive and destructive force, because when we live in a state of fear and guilt, we move into a scarcity mindset very quickly, where we're afraid we're going to run out of stuff. We're afraid we're not going to have enough to feed our families. We're afraid there's going to be a famine and we don't have control of assets. And so we start to sequester more than we need. And so out of fear, we can start to be that consumptive machine that we now recognize 7.8 billion,
Mhm.
humans on Earth have become, out of those two emotions that came out of a narrative of scarcity. And in this last year, we've had a narrative of a pandemic caused by a virus, when in fact we had a pandemic of fear and guilt that
Yes, thank you.
undermined
Yeah.
undermined our relationship to the microbiome and the virome.
Yes.
Fear and guilt, and the stress that comes out of that, is exactly what destroys our immune system's capacity to be in a healthy relationship to our environment. And then if our public response is isolate from people, that's the worst thing you can do for your microbiome.
Mhm.
Get away from nature, be afraid of the outdoors, go sit in front of your television, then put a polypropylene mask on. If you go outside, so you're breathing micro nanoplastics all day long that undermine the innate immune system's barrier to the viruses.
Yeah.
And if you happen to have a virus, it aerosolizes that virus rather than blocks the secretion. And so the masks have been shown for coronavirus not to hold any of it inside. In fact, it goes from a respiratory droplet coming out of your breath that goes 3 feet to an aerosolized virus shooting through a mask that can go for miles. And so
Whoa.
we are literally, by social distancing and masking up, we are becoming violent, machines of warfare, during warfare, because we're not doing it naturally.
Wow.
There's good studies showing that 7 hugs a day reduces your chance of having symptoms of flu by 35%. There's no intervention that's been shown to 35%. Vaccines don't reduce the rate of flu at all.
No.
Vaccines slightly reduce the length of the time you have symptoms if you get flu by like 6 hours, but they don't change the rate of flu, and never have. And we don't expect it to change the rate of coronavirus. And they keep telling a narrative that there's a 95% production rate if you take this new mRNA vaccine. What they're saying is that there will be 95% less symptoms which will be amazing. That will be quite a feat if they were to achieve that. But what's really happening is they are turning the cells of the human body into protein production machines to produce viral proteins. That's how this new mRNA vaccine is working. It's not a vaccine at all. It's a protein production mechanism. So you're literally genetically modifying cells to start making a protein that was made by the virus originally. And we have no idea what the consequences of being viral protein factories in our body. And so it's terrifying to know what's going to happen in 3 years, 5 years, 10 years when we have whole, generations that have been turned into viral protein generators instead of, an innate immune system relationship to the intelligence of the virome.
That's mind blowing. I can't believe you're not on CBC, BBC, and CNN speaking. I mean,
Uh,
that's the interesting question, and I get that also as an economist. I mean, I could never speak publicly about the money system because no one
no, you
ever
can't.
put
You
me on
can't say
there.
any of this on CBC, NBC. Like it's so contrary to this public narrative that's not based on science. It's based on 100-year-old belief. Literally, the vaccine belief, the germ theory belief, those are 150-year-old stories, narratives that have been told over and over and over again to such conviction that doctors are threatened, if we question this narrative, if we question the belief. And now with 30 years of explosive genomics data, we know we're wrong. We know that we are not against the viruses. There are 10 to the 15 viruses in my bloodstream right now. 10 to the 15, billions and billions of viruses in my bloodstream right now. There's 10 to the 31 viruses in the air I'm breathing, which is 10 million times more than our stars in the entire universe. And so it's just like we have the wrong model. We know we have the wrong model at the science level,
Not
but
only
the
the wrong
public
model.
narrative is way over here.
So, I mean, we could talk for hours, but I'm convinced that we need to spend more time on the narrative. Indigenous people, I mean, their
Yeah,
traditions are oral. They didn't have codified laws like the colonizers did, and the British did, and the Romans did. And so it's like we need to collectively write a new narrative, a more compelling narrative, as Buckminster Fuller says, that makes
perfect.
the former narrative not just obsolete but boring and fear based. And in
Right.
fact, the new narrative is one based on abundance and the way sunlight creates photosynthesis. I mean, we don't even understand how it works, and yet I said to students, I said, what's where does money come from? They said trees, and I said, yeah, but where does the tree get its energy from? That thing up there, right? I mean, which gives so abundantly that we don't even use a fraction of it. And
Yeah.
yet there's our model. There's a money system model. Um,
Yeah.
and so we persist in trying to write a new narrative as if we're scripting a movie here, a Netflix series. And I think it's the only way to get people's attention, and not with fear or stridency or anger, retribution, but simply we just need a more compelling narrative.
That's exactly right. What a compelling narrative it is. I mean, the science of the last 30 years is telling us that it's the biggest paradigm shift that's happened in human science. Period. The only other ones we could point to that were maybe starting to get towards this big was the discovery of 2,000 years ago by Pythagoras that the world was not flat, that we in fact had a spherical planet. Was so disruptive. It
Right.
challenged not just our science but our religious worldview.
Yeah.
And it was just mind blowing that we could be a ball and we're not falling off of it. Like how could we? Somebody's going to fall off the South Pole if it was round. So it changed everything. And then it would be 1,600 years later when we finally invented the telescope that, Magellan and all these guys pick up the telescope and they completely redefine the universe. And they realize that we're not at the center of the universe. We fully, until 1,600, thought we were. We thought that everything was orbiting around us. And to find out that we were swirling around, a sun that was swirling in some distant suburb of a very small galaxy that had a billion stars, that is in the far-flung areas, almost one of the darkest areas of a universe that's full of billions of universes. And so, that was, again, so disruptive, not just to science but to our religious worldview. Who are we then? Like, well, and to
Exactly.
this day, most people, e- especially with a Christian worldview, are trained into a narrative of, my God, no, there's no aliens. We are the top thing. Like, we are the highest consciousness in the whole universe. Like, it's the most astounding narrative that we could possibly tell. Like, really? Like, is that even important? Like, why do we have to be the most important thing that was ever invented? Because the English language with this narrative of a Garden of Eden and all that, says that we were born into a nature to be co-creative with it. Why did we have to be the most intelligent? Why did we have to be the penultimate purpose of God? Like, does God lose its purpose if we're not here? Like,
Yeah.
what happens when we go extinct in 80 years? Like, what happens to
Well,
God then? It's like we have these narratives that are just so baked in, and they're so small. They're so tiny. Our narratives are that we hang our hats on. The
yeah,
beauty of the real narrative is that, just as the indigenous people, today know, and I'm so grateful to the 3% that have survived.
exactly. That
The three
survived.
percent that have clung on to life against all of the hegemony, all of the abuses, all of the horrors of Western civilization and many
Yeah.
civilizations before us, the horrors that humanity has put forth on that indigenous wisdom, that narrative of connectedness, that narrative of the importance of community, the narrative of we are a pixel within the universe, is starting to be told in the science of the microbiome, to find out that
Wow.
the human cell is not at the center of human health. That's the same thing as finding out that the earth is not at the center of the universe. The human cell is not at the center of human health. At the center of human health is a vast microbiome of tens of thousands of species of bacteria, millions of species of fungi. And you start to, blow all of this up and you realize, oh my gosh,
My
we
God.
have it all wrong.
And then Bruce
Life
Lipton
happens.
comes along, right? And says the biology belief. What?
Yeah.
Like, so it's in our mind, it's in our ability. I mean, you and I have talked about, I mean, going into the consciousness stuff, it's like, what we believe, what we think is manifest. If we believe we were created in the image of love of God, then are we not love? We're not separated from that love, are we? I mean, and if the Genesis is right, everything was very good, very good. It wasn't bad. It wasn't scary. It was very good. So what didn't we get about the memo? That
Yeah.
things are very good. I created you to be not to dominate, to be stewards, and that's what the word economy means. And so for me as an economist, it's very frustrating to watch us go through this. Some people say, "Oh, we're living through a three-dimensional train wreck and horror show," and some of us are maybe ascending to higher levels of consciousness. But I don't want to leave the three-dimensional people behind either, because there's so many exciting things to do tomorrow when I wake up. Because what you're doing, and I mean, we could talk about the amazing. When I first heard you speak, and the only soundbite that came was like, in 2 years, farmers, when they get off of glyphosate and using Roundup, those soils are back to their natural vitality. In fact, the yields increase. That is just a sign of incredible resilience and hope. Like, so why aren't all of our agricultural lands in Alberta and Canada getting off of glyphosate? Because we know you've shown there's a connection with cancers. I mean,
Yeah.
how come we don't make this pivot, this change, when the evidence is increasingly clear that there's
Yeah,
a
when we
miracle?
set out on the track to start our nonprofit Farmers Footprint, we were, in the Midwest, northern Midwest, just south of the Canadian border there, and we were listening to farmers. And I set out as a scientist, having uncovered some of this relationship between Roundup and glyphosate and the destruction of our gut barrier and our immune system vulnerabilities that then come out of it and all of this. And so I went into the project thinking I need to show the world that glyphosate is destroying human health and therefore we need regenerative. What happened after a couple of weeks of being on these farms is we realized that this is not a story of glyphosate as a toxin. It's a story of macroeconomics being really contorted,
Mm,
and these farmers have become victim, just as the physician has become victim to a chemicalization of the narrative. And so just as a
mm,
physician is now ostracized if they step out of the pharmaceutical model, so will a farmer be ostracized if he steps away and says, I'm going to stop using all these chemicals. I'm going to a regenerative management of my systems. I'm not even going to plow my soil. That is so disruptive to the
of the
common narrative.
relationship with their neighbors too.
They're ostracized from the
Awesome.
church. They
Yeah.
can't go sit in the pews that they've been in for 5 generations. They can't sit at the bar that they've sat at for 5 generations. Like, it's complete ostracization at the social level, at the socio religious level, even.
Mm,
And so it's a deep, deep, manipulation of human psyche that's been co-opted by the same companies, which is so interesting to me. I mean, it's the
mm,
big chemical companies, Dow, 3M. These companies are right in bed with Pfizer and Merck and all of them. They're like all working in the same space to control human health or human environment and the greater ecosystems, agricultural food systems. So very few companies now are controlling the entire human experience, and you can see the level of you know abuse that's layered upon anybody that steps out of that common narrative. And it's interesting. I just sit back and I just wonder, when do we stop with the fifth grade mentality on the playground of just the bullies beating everybody up for their lunch money? Like,
Mm,
happening at the $1 trillion level now. We've got these bullies marching around threatening people and punching them in the nose and say, "Give me your lunch money, or else I'm going to destroy your livelihood. I'm going to destroy your reputation. I'm going to destroy your. Nobody's going to think you're cool ever again." Like that, it just happened to me on Instagram again this weekend. Like, it's just like relentless of people are so eager to punch you in the nose, to take whatever your progress you're making for themselves. And if we can show it as petty as, "Oh, that guy's going viral right now, I'm going to jump on and create a conspiracy video so that I can get more followers." It's not even money, they want followers. Like, it's like, what are we doing to each other? Like, what kind of community is this, that we've been reduced to this sort of infighting and this sort of opportunism, against one another, and we're always trying to like find the guy to stick the dagger in the back of next so that we can get a slightly higher position within our societal
yeah.
infrastructure of social media or otherwise. And so, I think all of these are ultimately symptomatic of a disconnect, right? And so
Yes.
the
Good.
disconnect that we have, whether we're talking macroeconomics or biology and human immune system, it's all symptomatic of the same thing, which
Hmm.
makes my job really easy. I run a portfolio company, intellectual property development firm that is focused on human health, energy, and ecology. These are three areas of innovation. So we start companies in all three of those tiers, and we go and do the same thing. No matter if we're talking about oil and gas industry or cancer, we go and solve the problem, which is disconnect, loneliness at the individual cell, over consolidation of resources in a small amount, and we decentralize the system. Anytime you decentralize and go to a distributed network of resources and communication, you improve the health of the macroeconomics or the individual with cancer. And so it's very exciting to me that the same
Hmm.
problems underlie all of the things that are driving us to our own extinction and to the destruction of the planet. We can simply reverse engineer that because it's the same mentality, it's the same fear and guilt, it's the same selfishness and greed that stems from the fear and guilt that comes out of all of this. And we fail to understand the abundance. We fail to understand the strength and uh, stability that comes from a decentralized system. And we always think that central is better. We always think that hierarchical is more powerful,
Well,
when in
we're
fact the most powerful thing we could do would be to cooperate.
well. I tell the story. I'd never heard the story until I met an Anishinaabe woman who said, Abraham Maslow came to southern Alberta, and he came up with the hierarchy of needs, which looked like a pyramid. There's that food guide pyramid on your fridge again. Thank you, Canadian Health Guide.
That's right.
And then I learned, no, he learned about the sacred hoop, the medicine wheel, that the human being was mental, physical, spiritual, emotional, a hoop that rotated clockwise through time through volition, free will.
Hmm.
Wait a minute. Spiritual enlightenment isn't at the top of your medicine wheel. It's in maybe in the east, and the east, always spirit comes from the east, and you start to unpack this. Like every human being is this beautiful hoop spinning through time and space, trying to stay like a balanced wheel. You can't have one quadrant. You can't have your physical well-being overriding your spiritual well-being. What a beautiful image. Now you can scale that. And what I'd like to talk about is, you talked about, as a forester again, like the strength of ecosystems is its diversity. That's what gives it resilience. And yet we've created these monocultures, whether it's in finance, yang currencies versus more yin and yang currencies, and over again we see these pyramidical structures. Uh, what what you and I think are talking about is creating a fully distributive, the blockchain language, where each of us, in a sense, are each other's brothers and sisters keeper. We all come to this world, as the Cree people say, each child born is an answer to a prayer. what prayer were your aunts saying, Zach, when you were conceived? Who knows, you know? But presumably you were leaping in your mother's womb when you got your auntie's prayer, right? That you're going to become this amazing scientist and physician. But I didn't know I'd become an economist by any means. At least
That's
ask
right.
my mother that. She says, no, you just came out smiling. So, but, but I
I
think
love
you
it.
you put all this together. You say, no, each one of us is here on a mission. Like the Blues Brothers. But what's our vocation? What's our calling? What's our special gift that we're here to share in an ecosystem of relationships? And that money no longer is a block. It should never be a uh, we don't even know what money is, where it comes from, and yet here we have an opportunity to create a new economy of interrelationships. Of that money is just it could be like water, it could be a public utility. The sun could be our model, or seashells like the Polynesians taught us, the wampum and all that. And it's all there. It's all there to just pick up and breathe a new life into it. Uh, you know, the next president, doesn't matter who the president is, but I think that's a flaw too. Like again, it's pyramidic.
Yeah.
So collectively, how do we? I think this is what you're doing with the farmers, or we're trying to do in our own little way. Our respective gens or spouses. My wife's in restorative justice. Your wife's in conscious capitalism, whatever that means. Sounds like a cool word. But really, I think it's about raising awareness that we are so incredible. We're so gifted. We have a lot of shit to get done, a lot of healing to do, a lot of restorative justice, a lot of ho'oponopono in the Hawaiian tradition.
Yes.
It's like every day I wake up is like Christmas. There's just opportunity. The pandemic is a good teacher and a wake up call. And I think what you're doing is so exciting that I think we're moving, off an end of the podcast. Like, what gives you hope, Zach? I mean, we're doing all these, I think we're doing great things. We're raising the consciousness, one person at a time. But systemically, we can imagine new systems, new money systems. Will they be implemented tomorrow, or will some other narrative like the Great Reset or Building Back Better, wherever those words came from, I don't know. Doesn't matter. Um,
That's right.
yeah,
Yeah, I mean, we're at the tipping point for sure, which is an exciting point to be born in, right? And so we can see the collapse of our ecosystems and our species happening right in front of us. In Hawaii right now, I can see it right out in our bay every day that the tides get higher. Sandbars that used to be above water are underwater. Our parking lots flood with every king tide now, and the ocean waters are rising. We have a collapse of stability within ecosystems that have been around for millions and millions of years, and the vast majority that have been most injured are soil systems that are under agricultural use. So that we now estimate that some 96% of all the soils that are arable in the world are now depleted or severely depleted. And we are now estimating, not me, but the industry of farming is now estimating that there may only be 60 harvests left on the planet because of the speed of detriment in topsoil now. We're losing 2 tons of topsoil per acre of farmland in the United States every year now. That is such a valuable asset that's disappearing literally down the drain of our river systems out into our oceans, never to be brought back. You can't go harvest that out of the ocean to bring it back in. You have to grow that soil through microbial intelligence and biodiversification of regenerative agricultural practices. But if we don't move to that regenerative practices, and we continue this current pace, we're losing right now about 11% of our gross domestic product in soil every year. 11% of GDP is being flushed down the toilet in the United States, $17 trillion
wow,
GDP, and we're losing $1.7 trillion, which is bigger than the energy industry as a whole,
exactly.
twice as big as our entire military operations. Like, it is a massive number,
Yeah,
is literally being lost in soil right now.
wow.
And so that number just in the United States alone is a harbinger of the crisis that we have, which is we are losing nature at an extreme rate. And with 60 harvests left on the planet, there's no technology that comes along to replace the biophotonic energy we get from plants. Like,
And
that just
and
doesn't
and then
happen.
and then we have your statistics on skyrocketing chronic illness levels. Perhaps the
Yeah,
so,
it's
but the question
which
I
match
have,
up, right? So it's like, the current estimates in the health side for the humans is that we could probably go extinct in about 80 years.
Right.
And so 65 is left, or 80 years as humans. So do you want to be alive for those last 20 years when we're just all starving to death? That's the interesting, calculation. But
Uh,
it's not surprising that those two timelines would have to line up, because we're talking about not humans, we're talking about biology. We're talking about a planet that is governed by the same biology, whether you're an earthworm or a human. They have to denigrate at the same rate. So if we don't change our behavior, we know that within a century, life on Earth is going to be, permanently and perhaps forever transformed or expired. And yet the tipping point is so exciting, because we see the speed at which regeneration happens when we create the new narrative of we are just an element within nature. We are not the the empire, top of the pyramid. Like we are just this small nugget of consciousness within this great sea of life. And when we see ourselves as that, we will steward the earth differently, and we can co-create with her. We can co-create within 200 years. We could have the most verdant soils that have existed in 60 million
that
years.
that's
200
why
years.
that's what I wanna build on is, we know from your work in 2 years, right? Okay, you can take the current acres or hectares of agriculture, crop and livestock, and we know that from your evidence in 2 years. I think the same is true of the gut health, yeah, I'm taking your ion gut, you know, I'm drinking the soil tea. It's helps. But the same I think is true for reversing chronic illness. Like if you can reverse cancers, I know you know that. And so if that's true at the individual level, if we can reverse these chronic states of ecosystem health and biome health or gut health, um, surely the only rhetorical question is why is there not a Manhattan Project conversation happening right now?
I think there is, that's the exciting thing for me is, I'm now sitting in rooms with some of the largest, California growers, for example, that have built multi-generational, 5 generation farms that are the biggest, pistachio, almond, tomato, table grapes, citrus growers in the world. And these operations have done more devastation to the water systems and soil systems of California than any other industry has ever done. And yet these are the guys that are sitting around tables trying to figure out how to, within the next 10 years, transition all of their acreage to regenerative, practices, because they know it's necessary. And not even from a planet, I don't even know if they care about the planet. I haven't heard any talk about care for the planet.
Yes.
They care for the survival of their multi-generational farm. And they
Yeah.
see
Yeah.
consumer sentiment and government sentiment changing so quickly now that they realize, man, if we don't get ahead of this curve and we don't start transitioning acreage, we're going to be out of business in a decade. And that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to
Excellent.
so quickly change the narrative that there's a necessity for transformation to happen quickly at these large agricultural systems levels. And ultimately the chemical industry is going to lose their hold because of the fact that they aren't the largest company ever created. The largest corporation ever created was the modern consumer.
Yeah, that's right.
The modern
And
consumer
we did that in
still.
the economics, labs of Chicago and Austria and all those. That's where that narrative came from. Utility maximizing creatures. No, I always say, what's a util? Is it a unit of happiness? What is it? Um, can
So
you
critical.
before we go talk about my favorite subject is redesigning the money system, and I know you and I have been in discussions of this blockchain technology called Humanity and what you're doing with the funds and what really simply gets me excited is like if I can help farmer Joe in Saskatchewan or Iowa get through the 2 years that he needs to transition out of glyphosate. I want I don't I want some kale in 3 years or whatever the payment is. In fact, maybe I don't care at all about payment, but the exciting idea or platform for helping each other, that money no longer is a barrier. Say, oh, where's the money going to come from? It's an illusion that the money is scarce. So, can you talk about what your vision is for regenerative financial system or money system?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, in large part, it's kind of getting rid of money as it exists. Money is, a dangerous thing in that it's become a thing. It's become something that can be commoditized in and of itself.
Hmm.
The United States drives its economy not out of making things anything more. It just does it by changing, ones and zeros in computer systems on the New York Stock Exchange. and we call that productivity. We call that GDP.
Yeah.
When nothing's being created, we literally create it out of the ethers of digital streams of information, and we pretend like we're a productive nation. We claim the largest economy in the world, when in fact we're not at all the largest economy in the world if you talk about real assets or
Right.
productivity at the level of any kind of economic measure. So uh, ultimately, it's exciting to imagine, what if we get rid of the need for, or the belief in, a fiat currency that has no backing. Fiat means a non-backed national currency that is staked on the reputation of the country, and which is really staked in the strength of its military. And so which empire do we most trust is basically what happens right now between the fiat currencies. Which country do we most trust to be as abusive as necessary to stay at the top?
Right.
And right
Exactly.
now, everybody feels like the United States is likely to continue to be the most abusive, or at any cost, the largest economy in the world. So they keep using the U.S. dollar as their reserve currency. Well, by doing so, every indigenous nation, every developing nation, every indigenous people that use that U.S. dollar as their reserve currency are part of the problem. They are strengthening the narrative, the appearance of strength, or the demand for the U.S. to continue to be abusive.
Yeah.
Whatever cost it takes, U.S. continue to do it. You can abuse people all over the world. You can kill farmers globally. You can take away their land. Do whatever it takes to keep your GDP growing, because we're all using your currency as our backing.
Yeah.
So that has to end. And so, as much as people are pointing their finger at the U.S., I have to say this is a global problem.
Absolutely
We're
global.
all in this,
Yeah.
and if we don't, as a globe, decide we're going to stop rewarding consumptive, destructive behavior as the most valued commodity on the planet, then we need to stop that globally. We can only stop it globally. And so, currency needs to become the thing that replaces money. Currency is the reality that money should only increase if it changes hands, and the currency or the value therein should never be able to be sequestered away and transited between banks or something like that, from this investment firm to this investment firm to this bank, and therefore money's being created. It needs to
Mm.
change hands to create productivity. And the concept of currency is it's moving. And so we've been working on an algorithm that allows the value of all of the money on the planet to rise, because it's a currency rather than a money. And so if the value exchange denomination is now an element of moving energy from one person to another, so that we can increase the rate of productivity within the soil systems, air systems, soil
Mhm.
systems, water systems, food systems, human health systems, and we start to create value and energy within the productivity of the planet, then we can't fail. If human behavior is rewarded for an improved function of biology on the planet, and we start to make the planet the generative denominator, then we win the game. And so the denominator, meaning the number that the top number of how many digits of currency do you have in circulation, the denominator is then how much asset is backing that. And
It's
so
the asset. Yeah, the natural asset.
yeah,
Yeah.
and so that's a
You have
non-fiat.
to, well, the soundbite here, the educational soundbite is it's fitting that banks use water metaphors. Banks, currency, liquidity, right? Except a bank actually means a bench from the old days. But it's true. So if we could create currency systems that are actually mimicking watersheds, the
Yeah.
natural vitality of watersheds, which include the soil health, then I think we've got a more compelling system that is totally equitable globally, because everybody lives in a watershed. You wouldn't live in a watershed if there was no water.
Yeah.
Um, so I think that to me has always been my model in my mind. So humanity, or the Earth dollar that we worked on a few years ago, could absolutely be a very indigenous way of seeing money systems as totally natural asset based.
Yeah, I would even go deeper than indigenous. It's biologically based,
Biologically based, thank
because
you,
I
yeah.
think we can point to a lot of indigenous cultures that developed their own versions of money and screwed themselves up.
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
there's
absolutely.
there's a long history of that, and so there's a tendency to think, well, if we could just go back 1,000 years, or if we could just go back 10,000 years, then we would have a healthy money system. We actually have to go back to the origins of life, to ask how did this planet become a generative machine that became so valuable that it would be a blue planet, gifted with 7.8 billion souls today. Why did all those souls show up right now? Because we have a valuable planet. Why
Yeah.
is the planet valuable? Because it has soil, water, and air that can generate life. And so, until we get back to that level of understanding of what our currency system should look like, we'll continue to create an extractive, destructive system.
Wow. Well, thanks, Zach. You've restored my confidence in humanity. Well, not necessarily all of humanity, but in the future for sure. And I really
Well,
appreciate your
we certainly defined the tipping point. Now it's up to all of
we
us to just choose which path we take.
as my friend Ron in Austin says, he was a brilliant script writer. Who's George Lucas said, uh, how do you see the narratives?" He says, "Uh," I said, "I bet you, Ron, you look up. Do you look up to the left, like in the Netflix series, Queen's Gambit?" He goes, "Yeah, actually, I look up and I could see the narrative and all the players playing out perfectly. So we need more script writers that say, let's write a new narrative that makes me want to wake up in the morning and not be full of fear and having to wherever that fear percussion comes from. So thank you for raising our consciousness as you have over the last 8 months. You're a gift to uh, our species, and thank you for your science wisdom and
I'm
thank you
just,
for being a recovering physician or a recovering
that's right.
physician
Recovering scientist, maybe. Yeah,
scientist. Yeah,
yeah, that's right. So yeah, no, I appreciate it. I recognize that I'm just a pixel in this thing that we call human, and it, it's interesting to me to realize no matter how wise I might make myself become through the constant surrender of my intellect, and that I increase my wisdom or my state of enlightenment or whatever the hell it is, it does nothing in this fabric of biology if I'm not in community and the community is not changing with me. And so thank you for being in community with me today, Mark. It's just always a pleasure to be with you. I so value your intellect, and but deeper than that, I really value your spiritual richness that you come in with, and the ways in which you have learned from and served indigenous groups, First Nations people, and the like, as well as groups throughout the world. I'm very grateful for your sense and desire for community at that global level, and thank you for telling
thank
a
you.
global narrative.
As James Bond says, I prefer being shaken, not stirred. Or I am
I
not
love
stirred, shall we say.
There you go. Very good.
Thanks so much.